Ancient times and the Ottoman Empire. If you pay attention to the news, then you're aware that there always seems to be some sort of conflict in the Middle East. Wars, civil wars, and acts of terrorism are common in the region. But why? Today we'll explore how the borders of the Middle East have created tensions among these nations, which has led to endless aggression. To understand the area, we need to examine the countries that make up the Middle East. What you may not know is that the countries considered Middle Eastern are in Africa, Asia, and Europe. In Africa, the countries generally associated with the Middle East are Egypt, Libya, and Sudan. In some cases, Sudan isn't included, and the same goes for Libya. The only European country is Turkey, which is also located in Asia. The Asian portion is the largest from Turkey down to the Sinai Peninsula. It expands to the west across Iraq and Iran, and it ends in Afghanistan. The Middle East stretches into the Arabian Peninsula and includes countries like Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Yemen. The Middle East is also located in an important region of world history. The Fertile Crescent is considered the birthplace of modern civilization. Modern-day Turkey, Iraq, and Syria were part of that important region. The soil was lush between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and farming may have begun there some 9,000 years ago. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all developed in the Middle East. Those three religions spread across the globe, and today, Christianity and Islam are the world's largest religions. For a while, parts of the Middle East were under the control of the Roman Empire, but eventually they became part of the Islamic Caliphates. The last empire associated with the Middle East was the Ottoman Empire, which started in modern-day Turkey during the 14th century, grew into a vast Islamic empire that had a territory in Western Asia, Eastern Europe, and North Africa. It reached its peak in the 16th century, but was a shell of its former self by the 19th century. By that point, European powers had expanded their empires. The two main players were Great Britain and France. The British controlled Egypt, Sudan, and Oman. They also controlled the jewel of their empire, India. The French were also controlling North Africa and had control over French Indochina in East Asia. The Suez Canal was officially opened by Egypt in 1868, and ownership of it went to Britain and France after they conquered Egypt in the 1880s. Agreements were made with other countries, but the canal became an asset in navigation and trade. It also became a strategic point for navies. As empires were built by European nations, they also developed powerful armies with a fleet of warships as well. Tensions between nations in Europe grew. Germany, unified in 1871, became a major power, and countries began forming alliances in Europe as tensions continued to grow. Nationalism was also on the rise in different parts of the world. Empires had ruled for too long, according to some, and people had a right to develop their own nations and develop their own governments. The tensions and nationalism led to World War I, which was fought between 1914 and 1918. World Wars and new countries. Britain and France were part of an alliance that fought another alliance between Germany and the Ottoman Empire. By 1916, Britain and France signed a secret agreement to divide the Middle East into zones of influence, but Russia and Italy would also be included in this secret agreement. France had control over areas that are currently part of Lebanon and Syria. It would also extend into what is now northern Iraq. The British were given control over a region in modern-day Israel and portions of southern Iraq. The Russians were given control of Istanbul and modern-day Armenia. The agreement was made with European interests in mind, but the lines drawn on the maps for the Middle East didn't take into consideration the differences in cultures and religions. This agreement would be known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The impact of this agreement was huge. There were promises made by countries like Great Britain for an Arab nation. England wanted Arab support during World War I to fight the Ottoman Empire. The support would supposedly lead to the development of an Arab country, and Arab leaders at the time were hopeful for the development of a sovereign nation. However, information would later be released showing the plans for the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which led to a great deal of distrust of the British by the Arab world. It was also discovered that there was an attempt to develop a Jewish state in the Palestine region, which was in the proposed Arab state. Things became more complicated when the US entered World War I. By the time peace was being negotiated, US President Woodrow Wilson wanted nations to have an opportunity to create their own nations. The British and French had no interest in Wilson's visions for all countries, though, especially those in the Middle East. After World War I, some modern-day Middle Eastern countries took shape. For example, Turkey became a secular republic under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the father of Turkey. The country would have been drawn differently due to the treaties developed following World War I. But Atatürk's policies and reforms turned the country into something that modeled Western Europe. There were conflicts between the Kurdish people living in Turkey and the Armenians. Atatürk stood his ground against the British, French, and even the Greeks, and Turkey's boundaries were changed to look like what we see in modern-day Turkey. As World War I ended, the world was at war again. But this time, Allied powers went against the fascist governments of Germany and Italy, who were allies with Japan. After the war, the victorious Allies sought peace and a way to contain the advancement of communism. This had an impact on the Middle East. However, peace was never part of the plan. Israel and Palestine, Part 1. During the late 19th and early 20th century, some changes would shape what would become Israel and Palestine. Nationalism created a Palestinian identity. Zionism shaped a Jewish identity, especially in Europe due to anti-Semitism and pogroms, organized violent attacks against Jews. Both groups wished to have their own nations in what is Palestine today. The British controlled the area after World War I. People who were Jewish wanted to flee Europe and settle in Palestine. This meant that tensions between the Jews and Palestinians were common, and there were also frequent acts of violence. There was an Arab revolt in 1936, otherwise known as the Great Revolt, that lasted until 1939 when it was put to an end. The British tried to cut down on the immigration of Jews from Europe to appease the Palestinian population. And it was also the British that helped to train a paramilitary group of Zionists known as the Haganah. A solution of sorts was proposed by the United Nations following World War II. It would divide Palestine into two states. Israel would be a Jewish state while Palestine would be strictly for the Palestinians. But Jerusalem was to be something of an international city where Jews, Christians, and Muslims could live peacefully due to the area's religious importance. This proposal wasn't accepted and war erupted between Israel and Palestine in 1948, lasting a full year. Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria aided the Palestinians. Israel expanded their borders following the conflict due to agreements signed by Arab nations. Two Palestinian areas were established. The West Bank would be controlled by Jordan, and the Gaza Strip would be under Egyptian control. Palestinians were displaced during and after the fighting. Also, the Arab world was angered and bitter following that conflict, so the Israeli military dug in, and UN peacekeepers were summoned. Israel and Egypt. War in the Middle East erupted on June 5, 1967. It happened due to tensions that had grown between Israel and neighboring Egypt. These two countries were no strangers to conflict, though. Gamal Abdel Nasser, president of Egypt, fought during the conflict with Israel in 1948 and 1949. Then, in 1956, he seized and nationalized the Suez Canal. This move, however, angered Israel, Britain, and France. So much so, in fact, that Israel launched the first in a series of attacks against Egypt in October 1956, with Britain and France agreeing to aid. Nasser had received weapons from the Soviet Union, and they threatened a nuclear attack of Western Europe if Britain and France didn't withdraw from the Suez Canal. The United States also asked Britain and France, their allies, to move out of the area. The US was upset that they weren't aware of British and French actions in the Suez Canal. Also, the United States didn't want the Soviet Union to have its finger on the button for its nuclear arsenal. In the end, Israel, Britain, and France withdrew from the Suez Canal, and Egypt was victorious. And from that point on, Israeli ships weren't allowed to use the canal. Israel got their revenge, though, on June 5, 1967, when they went to war with Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. It took Israel 6 days to achieve victory. Israel took over the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the Sinai Peninsula. Even Jerusalem was under Israeli control. Tensions between the two countries continued into the 1970s, and it was September 1978 when U.S. President Jimmy Carter brought the leaders of Israel and Egypt to Camp David in Maryland for a summit. Carter hoped that some sort of peace agreement would be hammered out between the two rivals. After 13 days, the Framework for Peace in the Middle East was signed. The document was laid out in 3 parts. The first part was developing Palestinian governance of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The second part was the plan for a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. The third and final part was similar treaties with Israel's neighbors. It was March 1979 when Israel and Egypt signed a peace treaty. Normal diplomatic relations were to resume, and the two nations would agree not to be aggressors. Israel left the Sinai Peninsula, and the two nations agreed that it would be a demilitarized zone. Egypt also allowed Israel to use the Suez Canal once again. This agreement didn't sit well with the Egyptian people, though. In 1981, members of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad assassinated the president of Egypt who had signed the treaty. Do you find this topic interesting? Would you like to see more videos on subjects like this one? Let us know in the comments down below, and while you're at it, subscribe to the channel. Israel and Palestine, Part 2. Israel had a difficult relationship with Palestinians after the Six-Day War. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO for short, was formed in 1964. They became more militant by 1968, however, when they formed the Palestinian Liberation Army. The Israeli army was occupying the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and eventually, a conflict between Israelis and Palestinians turned violent. The PLO even used terroristic actions to achieve their goal of removing Israel from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Israelis were moving into the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. These settlers, who numbered 800,000 by 2010, strained the relations between the two. But perhaps the most difficult of times was during the late 1980s into the early 1990s, when the first Intifada was launched by the Palestinians. This uprising ranged from non-violent demonstrations to throwing rocks and Molotov cocktails at the Israeli military. Clashes saw some 130,000 Palestinians injured and over 1,000 killed. This was the time of the rise of Hamas. They were an organization that felt disappointed by the PLO. Hamas was more militant and was willing to make sure Israel was destroyed. They've been labeled a terrorist organization by many nations. The Oslo Accords of 1993 were part of a declaration of principles between Israel and the PLO. There was something of an agreement for the Palestinians to have some sort of civil and security self-rule. This agreement angered Hamas and the Israelis. Another Camp David meeting was proposed in 2022, but it didn't lead to any kind of agreement. The Second Intifada began in 2000 and lasted until 2005. This conflict led to the deaths of over 4,300 Palestinians and Israelis. Walls are now built and checkpoints are set up in certain areas because the belief is that the violence can be contained but never ended via negotiations. Israel left the Gaza Strip, but they have it isolated where economic hardships are all too common. Iraq and the Kurds. Israel isn't the only country to have major disputes with neighbors in the Middle East. Iraq would engage in wars with its neighbors in the late 1980s and the 1990s. Iraq was a country that was created following World War I. It was controlled by the British after achieving independence in 1932. A monarchy was in power, but in 1958 a revolt toppled the monarchy. A socialist but pro-Arab group, the Ba'ath Party, seized power 10 years later in 1968. They sought a country free from imperialism and colonialism. The Ba'ath Party claimed to be socialists, but in reality they were an authoritarian regime. Their most infamous leader would be Saddam Hussein. Following the 1968 rise to power of the Ba'ath Party, Hussein was a key player for the nation. He helped nationalize their oil industry, which was the second most abundant supply in the world. The oil money allowed them to develop their military, and one of their targets would be the Kurdish people of Iraq. The Kurds are a people without a nation who aren't part of an Arab group. They're closely related to the Iranians who have people in modern-day Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria. They were a group that was ignored during the development of Middle Eastern nations following World War I. The Iraqi government tried to have the Kurds assimilate into their culture, but they refused and rebelled. The government of Iraq had promised them autonomy, but the promises never materialized. So the Kurds fought back in 1961. The Iraqi government then displaced the Kurds in northeastern Iraq in 1974, causing more fighting to erupt. Iran joined the conflict, but the first Iraqi-Kurdish war didn't last long. Hussein took full control of Iraq in 1979 via a purge, and his rule of Iraq would last until 2003. Iraq and conflict. The war between Iraq and Iran lasted from 1980 until 1989 and claimed the lives of some 500,000 people. What brought them to war involved the claims and use of a river known as Shatt al-Arab, which is formed by the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Iran would aid the Kurds that were fighting with Iraq, and that irritated the Iraqi government. Tensions between the two nations grew when the Ayatollah Khomeini led the Islamic Revolution in Iran, which forced the leadership out of the country. Iran wanted an Islamic revolution for all Arab nations, and this was something that worried Saddam Hussein. He saw it as a potential threat to his power. Then, Iraq invaded Iran in 1980 and the fighting continued until 1988. Both Iran and Iraq attacked each other's oil tanker ships in the Persian Gulf, which resulted in Western powers like the United States having ships in the Gulf to protect oil tankers. A ceasefire was called, though, in the summer of 1988. The war with Iran meant Iraq had to borrow money to fund their fighting, and one country that financed Iraq was Kuwait. Located south of Iraq, Kuwait had large oil reserves that Hussein wanted due to sanctions on Iraq. He also wanted Kuwait to cancel the Iraqi debt. But that wasn't all. Hussein believed Kuwait was historically part of Iraq, so he decided to invade the country. This act of war brought in the United States military, which allowed the war to end quickly. The countries of the Middle East were created following World War I and World War II. They were planned by Europeans who saw resources and not people. Conflict is still happening in the Middle East to this day. Recently, there has been fighting in Syria, Yemen, and Libya. There's still conflict in Israel and Iraq as well. The two countries are struggling post-Hussein. What are your thoughts about the endless fighting in the Middle East? Let us know what you think in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.